Hello everyone, welcome to Drum Tower. This is actually the first time we've done this in front of a live audience, so it's very exciting to be doing this with you here in New York, and we're really looking forward to answering some of your questions later on. A reminder that you can submit those questions by scanning the QR code on the screen. For those of you who aren't already Drum Tower listeners, I hope more of you will be after this. We should start with some introductions. My name is Jeremy Page. I am the Economist's chief China correspondent based in Taiwan since September of last year. I was previously based in mainland China for a total of 15 years, most recently with the Wall Street Journal from 2010 to 2021. And it's my colleague, Sarah Wu. Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah Wu. I'm the Economist China correspondent based in Beijing. I have a broad remit, so I write about everything from tech advances to econ policy, cultural change to social issues. And previously, I was based in Taipei, covering semiconductors and geopolitics, and before then, in Hong Kong, covering the pro-democracy protests and society more broadly.
And today we're delighted to be joined also by Li Yuan, columnist for the New York Times and fellow podcaster, host of the fantastic Booming Bai podcast, which you should also subscribe to if you don't already. Li, thank you so much for joining us today. It's particularly a particular pleasure to be with you because we used to be colleagues
Yes.
back at the Journal. In fact, when I first arrived there in 2010, you were already there with the Chinese language service. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, my name is Li Yuan. I'll go by Li. I was born in China, and I was a journalist in China for Xinhua News Agency, and then I came here to Columbia Journalism School. I joined the Journal here in 2004 and went back to China to be managing editor of the Chinese Wall Street Journal website, and then I became a tech columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and then joined the New York Times in 2018 in Hong Kong, covering tech as well, and then moved to New York in 2023. I write a column called The New World, basically write about anything about China, but my main interest is talking to Chinese people in China and outside China.
Fantastic. And for this episode of Drum Tower, we are going to be discussing how reporting on China has changed over the last couple of decades, how journalists inside the country and outside are navigating the present-day reporting environment there, and how new tools, including artificial intelligence, might help to provide some fresh insights into this rapidly changing nation. So, to get things started, I wanted to turn the clock back to 1997 when I first arrived as a reporter for Reuters news agency in Beijing, because back in those days, the reporting environment in China was in some ways more restrictive than it is today. You know, as a foreign journalist, you had to get permission from the government to report outside Beijing or Shanghai. You had to apply to the local branch of the foreign ministry, and they would set up all of your interviews, which would tend to be extremely sort of heavily scripted. There was a much more limited media ecosystem in China, so you had a relatively small number of state publications, newspapers and journals, television channels and radio stations that would monitor to try and find out more about what was happening in the rest of China outside Beijing and Shanghai. There was very few people online. There was obviously no social media, and very few people had mobile phones. So it was tough to even contact people outside of those two cities. There was a fair bit of surveillance, mostly physical. You would get tailed quite a lot. We were bugged, I think, in our offices and our apartments. But I think one of the important points to note about that period is that it was relatively easy to sort of work around these restrictions. And even at the very sort of center of power in Beijing, for example, one of the first big stories I reported on was in '99 with the Falun Gong protests, and my job was to go down to Tiananmen Square as a relatively junior reporter at Reuters. I was sent down every day to Tiananmen Square to basically count the protesters, to get a sense of how big these protests and how long they were going to last. So I would have to go down there at sort of 8 a.m. and certain days, like every few minutes, somebody would be jumping out of the crowd and pulling out a banner from their trousers and from shouting these Falun Gong slogans, and then the plainclothes cops would sort of jump out of the crowd and start chasing them and tackle them to the ground, and then someone else would pull out a banner, and all these bemused Chinese tourists would be standing around and like, what on earth is happening? And I would often get detained, but you just go back the next day and keep reporting. And I eventually sort of learned to sort of spot these protesters in advance, and got talking to one who took me to where she was staying on the outskirts of Beijing, and introduced me to there were hundreds of other Falun Gong followers there, all planning to go to the square sort of over the next few days to protest. So that was the first time we really got a sense of the scale of these protests and how long they would last. So Li, we started our careers at roughly the same sort of point in time, but you started, with Chinese state media. Tell us a bit about your recollections of the political and reporting environment back then.
Talking about Falun Gong, I remember the day that Falun Gong gathered around the Zhongnanhai, the leadership compound in 1999. I was still an editor at Xinhua, junior editor, so it was a Sunday, I believe. So I was on duty, and I remember one of the colleagues came over to the office and said it took him almost like an hour, 2 hours to get through the crowds to get to Xinhua, which is very close to Zhongnanhai and to Tiananmen Square. And it was, of course, the next day I remember I was sitting really close to the international news desk, like where the senior editors gather, and they would have like a morning meeting every day. And I remember they were talking about these are things you are not supposed to write about or report on, and Falun Gong I always overheard what they were talking about. So that was one of the things. And in 1990s and 2000s, I think in China, one of the big things in the 2000s was what we call the market-oriented media outlets. Those are the Southern Weekly and Southern Metropolis and all those newsletters started around that time, actually in late in 1990s, but they became really popular in the 2000s. Those are we would go out and buy them on the newsstand, and we would read stories that the state news outlets would not write about corruptions in the provinces and what happened to ordinary Chinese, like sometimes really, really touching stories. So I think like 2000s, the 1990s, it's mainly the state media. People really didn't have too much access to any information outside the state media. But the 2000s became different. There was a news industry, and of course it's always censored, but at the time the journalists were pushing for more limit, like they were pushing to get, they were like really aggressive. They tried to get the best stories. Investigative reporters became a job many college graduates aspire to, and that was something really interesting.
It's just so hard to imagine today, because I feel like the investigative journalists in China now are seen as such a rare breed.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite...
It's a disappeared job. Like we wrote about it about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I think the Times wrote several pieces about it, and Jean Police is here, and she wrote about the disappearance of investigative journalists. Yeah. But that's called the golden age of Chinese journalism, if there was ever a golden age.
Absolutely. And you decided to come back to China from the US sort of in 2008, so kind of at the high point of that.
Yes,
that golden
I was
age.
here in 2008. I was a telecom reporter writing about US telecom, the birth of the first iPhone, and I was really enjoying it, like learning a lot of things about American journalism. And then the journal wanted to grow its Chinese website. I was the first China-born reporter there. So they approached me, and I was like, I don't want to go back to China. I have a great life here in New York. And then 2008 was a very big news year in China. Of course, the Olympics, but it also remembered the Great Sichuan earthquake. I read so many wonderful, heartbreaking stories from Chinese journalists. And then I read all the protests about the torch relay, of the Olympic torch relay, and all the things. And I was like, why am I sitting here in New York when so much is happening in my country? So I went to the journal. I was like, have you found anybody? Now I want to go back. That was like May 2008, right after the Sichuan earthquake. And by end of July, like maybe 10 days before the Olympic Games, I was already moved back in Beijing. Yeah, so it was the height, like the really, I would consider the height.
Yeah, absolutely, with hindsight, because it wasn't just, it was partly to do with the that sudden sort of flourishing of investigative journalism in China, which was partly related to market conditions, the need for them to make money, but also restrictions on foreign reporters had been relaxed a bit ahead of the Beijing Olympics. You had many more people online. Mobile phone use proliferated, so it was much easier to sort of communicate with people. But you also had this very active community of NGOs, which were being sort of tolerated to a larger degree then. I mean, they were still within certain sort of parameters, but there were activist lawyers who became sort of very useful sources for a lot of us. You had a business community that was very outward facing, right?
Yes, the entrepreneurs, they're like really, they were not only business leaders, they wanted to be the opinion leaders, right? Many of them wrote blogs. Their blogs were followed by millions, tens of millions of Chinese. And then when Weibo came along around 2010, and they all became like the big, they became the huge influencers, and it was like just really interesting time in China. Like everybody had opinion about something, and of course you're constantly censored, but still like people were willing, and there was room to push, right? So it was like, I feel like an old person talking about. Yes.
But you were right at the forefront of this sort of social media revolution. You had a big following yourself on.
Yes,
on
I had. I used to have I was very active, partly because of my job. I was the editor of the Chinese Wall Street Journal, and that was how you grow the influence. And so I became very active. I just can't believe how active I was that time. Like now, I was telling Jeremy, I went to Japan for 2 weeks earlier actually last month. I didn't even post a single picture on Instagram. I used to feel I had so much to share, but now I'm.
Well, now you can do it through Booming Bai. You don't have to. You don't have to worry about social media.
Actually, I share too much already.
But I wanted to talk a bit more about sort of Weibo in that particular sort of moment, because it was extraordinary when you think back to that time. The Chinese government hadn't really yet developed these censorship tools to control Weibo or some of the other social media platforms that were emerging then. So you had really for the first time in Chinese history, this national conversation and information, including sort of very sensitive information, sort of just flowing around the country almost in real time. And there were a couple of massive stories like the high-speed rail crash in 2011.
Yes.
Where the government really lost control of the narrative, and it became
and the
a huge
Prime Minister
scandal.
had to go to the scene and then kind of like try to calm down the public opinions, the public outrage. That was like unbelievable. I can't even imagine anything like that today, right? Yeah.
And then the other one was the Boschilai scandal in 2012.
My God. Yes.
Where
Jeremy, if you didn't know, Jeremy broke the story about Boschilai's wife killed. Yeah.
That's kind of you to say, but there were lots of other people who reported like different aspects of that story, including some Chinese investigative journalists who very bravely revealed some of the first details. And I think that story in particular was a great illustration of how that reporting environment in which you had all these different sources, including social media, but also Chinese journalists, you had the Chinese business community, you had people who'd dealt with Boschilai and Bo's family, and that allowed us to sort of reveal,
and the people were willing to talk.
Yes.
If you found them, they might be willing to talk, right?
Exactly. And then, of course, very soon after that, Xi Jinping comes into power, and the reporting environment starts to change pretty dramatically. There's a big crackdown on the big Vs on social media. The censors take control of some of those pioneering Chinese media outlets.
Can I interrupt here? Like when Xi Jinping came to power in November, December 2012. Of course, the first thing he did was the Southern Weekly New Year editorial. That was like annual New Year editorial that is published by this very influential newspaper that we all went out to buy every week. And it kind of set the tone for the year, like people's aspiration, the public aspiration for the year. So that was the first sign that what was going to come out of the Xi Jinping rule. It was they really they censored, they resoled the editorial before it was published. Like before that, there was censorship, but the rule was kind of like agreement was that the newspapers would publish something, but you will be responsible for the consequences. And after that, the censors will tell you not to publish something.
Right.
It's kind of like, But the big way was interesting because the internet, Xi Jinping also set up this new cyber administration. Remember, he got this former journalist, Lu Wei, from like a former colleague of mine at Xinhua News Agency, and he invited people like us, like me, and like he promised Xi Jinping he's going to control the internet. And we all just laughed. I was like, ha ha ha, how can you control the internet? And of course he did.
More or less, yeah.
Joke is on us.
And then, of course, when you move through the first Trump administration and then COVID, these restrictions get tighter and tighter. You have a large number of, particularly American reporters, expelled from China, but also some from other countries. Others put on short-term visas, still more refused visas to come back to China, especially those who have sort of political contacts and experience of political reporting. And that's pretty much how things were when you moved to China, Sarah, in 2024?
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about what that felt like and how the reality that you found sort of compared with your expectations.
So I guess my expectations going in were pretty low. I was based in Taiwan, where many of my friends had either been kicked out of China or had left on their own accord. And their stories made me brace myself for this move. And so after covering the presidential election in Taiwan in January 2024, days after that I moved to Beijing. And I think the backdrop there, it felt like it was a more inward-looking society. There's a lot more suspicion of foreigners. When I'm riding the subway, I can see ads on the screens saying, don't give foreign spies your photos, don't give them information. So I think all of this propaganda push does manifest in my interactions with ordinary people. And so going from Taiwan, where it's very easy to do vox pops, for instance, to Beijing, where I started off reporting on electric vehicles, which was not a sensitive topic at the time. Later on, it became a slightly more sensitive. But even just trying to do vox pops in a Huawei store in Beijing, I remember being shocked when someone chased me out of the store, calling me fake French news. At the time I was working at Reuters, which is not French, but I was so humiliated that I couldn't even correct him. But over time, these kinds of interactions, you just realize it becomes part of the job. And I remember when I was in Hohhot I think it was last year, Hohhot had announced these birth subsidies, this Cash for Kids scheme, and all the economists were talking about it. My inbox was filled with estimates of what the GDP impact could be. But I wanted to know what people on the ground actually thought about this, and so I went to go speak with women there if this would change their minds. And I remember speaking with this middle-aged woman. She was fascinating. She told her daughters that they shouldn't have kids unless they're really serious about it. She herself was divorced. And we had this great conversation. But towards the end, she turns to me and asks me if I'm a foreign spy. And I think it's the sense of like, people are willing to talk, but at the back of their minds, there's still like this lingering suspicion of who you are, how close can they become to you, or how much can they trust you, how much can they share with you. And so I think that being the backdrop of a lot more suspicion and it being harder to access, whether it's officials or academics on the record. I think we've had much more luck talking with academics on background or off the record to try to understand how things work or what's happening. And yeah, so I think that's kind of the bigger backdrop of just a lot more suspicion of foreigners and especially of foreign journalists.
And I think you've sometimes been surprised by, how ready people are to talk with you, in spite of all these warnings about foreigners and foreign spies, in some areas, it's still relatively easy to have those conversations. But it does depend a lot on, your own nationality, the nationality of the media outlet you're working for. If you are American or you're working for American media, you definitely get more scrutiny. And I think it also depends a lot on what the story is. If it's a more political story, obviously you're going to get more attention for the authorities. There are certain places that are almost impossible to get to these days. Tibet, in fact, for a long time has been very difficult to get to as a foreign reporter, apart from on trips arranged by the foreign ministry, which they do very rarely these days. Xinjiang you can go to, but you get followed and watched so closely it's almost impossible to interview anyone without putting them in danger. I've thought about this a lot, and it seems like over time China's basically quite successfully engineered this situation where you have a lot fewer foreign reporters. They have, the ones that are there have fewer political contacts and generally, I think, sort of less political experience because of the people who haven't been allowed to come back and the people who've been kicked out. And, in the areas where you are permitted to report, I think that's still within very sort of strictly defined parameters. And those parameters are constantly moving, aren't they? Because it's things that were previously not sensitive are suddenly becoming sensitive, right?
Yeah, can you I'm curious why EV has become kind of sensitive.
Yeah, I think the EVs, when I started reporting on them, the tariff conversation, the EU tariffs on Chinese EVs, when that started, I think more companies became nervous about talking about it. and once it becomes political. So I think covering business in China is this nice way to still talk to people, because I think people want to, especially with cars and things that hadn't been political yet, people still want to explain like what's happening in their industry. Some of them want to export their products, so they're still more interested in engaging with foreign media. But I think the lines of what is sensitive shifts all the time. So I think in the past, maybe there are the obvious, like the 3 Ts, Taiwan, Tiananmen, Tibet. But even in the 2.5 years I've been in Beijing, we can see the line shifting so much, where unemployment, gender, even EVs, like these things become sensitive and people become more reluctant to speak. And for us as journalists, it's not so much, I think we don't think about it so much in terms of like what we're going to write about. We would write about it regardless, but we're thinking about it more in terms of how this will impact our sources. So recently I was writing about divorce and talking to academics, talking to lawyers, talking to women who have been divorced. And I was struck by how one of the academics was telling me that she's monitored so closely by her university, all of her comments. And she was happy to talk, but she really didn't want to be quoted with the word divorce in the line. And so things that hadn't previously seemed so sensitive have suddenly been made more risky.
Right, even the sort of lying flat phenomenon, which we and others have written lots about, and Chinese economists and others used to be perfectly happy to talk about, because it's a phenomenon that even the government has been happy to talk about it. But just the other day, the Ministry of State Security suddenly said that this was all part of a foreign plot. That basically the lying flat thing, for those not familiar, it's the idea that younger Chinese are sort of dropping out, choosing not to strive, to find good jobs because it's not worth it, because you're not going to be paid enough and it's too hard to get ahead in Chinese society. So you just either drop out and live at home with your parents, or take a low-paying job and just sort of enjoy an easy life. Mm-hmm. And this is now apparently a foreign plot. So I think we'll find it increasingly hard to interview people even about that. So another sort of example of the red lines shifting. I wanted move on to sort of how we and others sort of get around some of these restrictions, because of those expulsions and the refusals of visas over the last few years. There are now quite a lot of media organizations which are covering China partly from within the country and partly from outside. Some of the bigger news organizations have sort of offshore operations, Singapore, South Korea. I'm often asked sort of like how we manage to do that. Certainly for The Economist, we sort of have a sort of hybrid model in many ways. Where myself and others outside the country, we do what we can. Keeping in touch with old contacts, which is possible to a certain extent. You have to be careful about what you say on communication channels, but you have to do that inside China as well. But there are some old contacts you can keep in touch with. I do a lot of reporting on sort of what China does outside its borders, because China engages with the world, in so many different ways, through trade and investment and cultural exchanges and military diplomacy. So if you're willing to travel and you've got a budget for it, which thank goodness The Economist still does, touch wood, long may that continue, you can often come into contact with Chinese business people, sometimes officials, and they can be more comfortable speaking outside China than inside. So, I was just in Norway. I was north of the Arctic Circle for a conference of Arctic researchers, including China's top scientists on the subject. So I got myself into the conference and had 3 days hanging out with these scientists and having lunches and dinners with them as well. And they were still quite careful about what they said, but I think, I was able to get, some insight into, how China's approaching the Arctic. But the other sort of, I think, increasingly valuable sort of source for us, or sort of community of sources, is in the overseas Chinese community, because that used to be relatively apolitical, I would say, apart from a few big name dissidents based overseas. But because of these political changes, I think there's been an exodus of perhaps more politically minded Chinese, more entrepreneurially minded, who were sort of chafing at these restrictions. There is now a very interesting community in Tokyo, but also parts of Europe. And so I think a lot of us are sort of tapping into those sources. And a lot of them are also reporting themselves on China through newsletters, through social media, and through podcasts. And of course, Booming Bai is a great example of this. So Li, I wondered if you could tell us a bit more, first of all, about sort of why you decided to do this.
I decided to do it out of outrage. I was in Seoul. I was kicked out of Hong Kong, so I stayed in Seoul in South Korea for 2 years while waiting for my work visa in the US. I was in Seoul in 2022, and Shanghai was locked down. And it was a huge shock to not only to Shanghai people, but also many Chinese, because it's still unmanageable that they could lock down a city of 25 million, 30 million people. And they did. And then, just for like a week or two, like every day, I was just reading all the WeChat posts, videos, audios, images people posted online. I just sat there and cried every day. I just couldn't help it. It was so traumatic what people went through. So I worked for the Wall Street Journal for 14 years, and then the New York Times, and I communicated. Basically, I wrote in English and I communicated to an English audience. But at that moment, I felt like I wanted to communicate with Chinese people in my own language, in Chinese. So I asked the Times whether it was possible. I didn't have energy to write another, like a newsletter or whatever. So I loved listening to podcasts. So I asked the Times whether it was okay if I start a Chinese podcast. And thank God they approved immediately, and which is, I didn't know, which is super, super rare. And I just started. And it became very, I wouldn't say like very quickly, like it took like maybe 6 months. It just happened that year was a big political year in China as well, was the 20th Party Congress, and Xi Jinping got his third term, and also the white paper movement, the protests, and it just became like people just came to me, started coming to me, and was also like I started talking to people, get their voices out, and it just became very popular by November, December, and it just happened very quickly, and I didn't realize the Chinese people really wanted to have an outlet to not just to talk to me, to a journalist, but they also want to hear each other's voices. That was also very important to them. So that was how I started, and I never imagined that it would become a very valuable source for my reporting for the New York Times. I live here, and it's very difficult to interview people inside China, not to mention covering China from outside China. And now it's become a very good tool for me. Like really, it's like it's just very difficult. I still use Chinese internet every day. I still read all kinds of things and what they post, what are censored, and the comments and all those things. But it's still very different when I hear people like people who spend an hour or 2 hours sharing their stories. It's different. Yeah. So I really I'm very grateful people are still willing to talk to me.
And you have about 300,000 subscribers now on YouTube, is that right?
Yes, have 300,000 subscribers on YouTube, and also, more, some more on Spotify, Apple Podcast, yeah.
So can I ask, do you have a sense of sort of who they are and where they are? Sort of, are many of them inside China, the actual sort of people in your audience?
Yeah, actually, looked up before I came here. Mainland China and Hong Kong make up more than 30% of the audience, which I would consider pretty good. And also, like the US is like a quarter, but it's kind of difficult. That's for YouTube. So it's a little bit hard to tell because I don't know how YouTube knows where people access it from. Like, if they use VPNs, that's in Japan, or for a while I found like we got quite many listeners from Iran. That was like 3 years ago maybe. And I was wondering maybe they use some kind of like a connection in Iran. I couldn't really figure out, but based on the YouTube numbers, yeah, about 30%. And I consider it pretty nice. Yeah. And also beside that, we make the audio files and also the transcript downloadable. So I know for a fact there are WeChat groups in China. People just like, this is Ian Johnson, a journalist, like he told me, people don't speak in those WeChat groups. They just share audio files. And a lot more people actually listen to the podcast on WeChat, which is amazing.
And do you sometimes get feedback directly from people?
Oh, all the time. It's really, yeah.
Within China, I mean.
Within China, yes. And they share their stories. Sometimes, sometimes I call on people, I want to write about middle age unemployment, and people would write me, so many people wrote me like super long letters, like sharing their lives. Then I would reach out to them and then have interviews with them. And sometimes people just want to share their stories. And almost every day I get emails, or Twitter private messages. And it's, people really want to. Of course, people are scared. They're scared, but they just don't ever underestimate people's willingness to speak. I think that's like maybe journalism 101, but it still surprised me how much people want to talk about their own stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So at the same time as sort of those sort of basics of journalism are still so important, you've also got the emergence of these new tools, particularly in the sort of the world of open source and intelligence. Even in my last few years in China, sort of between 2016 and 21, as this media environment was becoming more restrictive, we started to rely more on sort of government data, on procurement documents, satellite images, that sort of thing, to try and sort of work out what was going on. That was particularly important in reporting on the internment camps in Xinjiang,
yes.
Where there were some researchers overseas who did a lot of the work in sort of identifying some of the government documents and the satellite images, but then we and others did a lot to sort of verify those documents, find them on the same sort of government procurement sites where they were literally, you had people advertising for contracts saying we need, a lot of barbed wire and some, guard posts and things. It was almost that sort of obvious what was going on. But then we would also send reporters to those sites, where you had the satellite image, you had the procurement documents, but that wasn't proof that something had actually been built there. So then we'd physically send someone there to see that there was something that looked more or less like a camp, and we would try to talk to people very difficult to do in Xinjiang. I spent a lot of time in Kazakhstan because there were ethnic Kazakhs who'd been put in the camps and then through pressure from the Kazakh government were later released. But you could interview them in Almaty and so get a sort of first-hand account of what was going on inside them. But now you've also got people starting to use AI to scrape much larger sort of quantities of government data and state media and social media, and they're using that to sort of identify sort of new trends in policy, but also in Chinese society. Some extraordinary stuff that's being done. There's a guy called Ryan Fedasyuk, I think that's how you pronounce his name, at the American Enterprise Institute, who he used Claude and a personal AI agent to build a tool that scrapes something like 1,400 Chinese and English language sources, pulls them into a dashboard, and then automatically drafts a daily summary, which is published on Substack. There's a lot of other sort of tools being developed. We do a bit of this at The Economist. A colleague did a great report tracking the rise and fall of wolf warrior diplomacy, the sort of very confrontational approach to diplomacy that China was taking at one point, and he downloaded 16,000 press conference responses from the Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson, and then
unmanageable 5 years ago, right?
Yeah,
now
and he used ChatGPT to sort of measure the level of belligerence in them,
right.
And produced a great story.
Yeah, I just read this. There's a Substack called tracking. The People's Daily, right? Yeah, and they just did. They just started tracked 7,000 statements by Chinese officials in the People's Daily, and then they measure how hostile they were to the United States and all those things. That's so interesting, right?
Yeah.
It's like the degree of hostility and when it happened, and it's just like gives you so much insight.
Yeah, or in analyzing sort of Chinese politics, back in the day, when you spotted a new turn of phrase on the front page of the People's Daily, and you wanted to know sort of the origin of this phrase and how often it had been used, you often had to consult the sort of few academics in the world who really studied this stuff and could
until a few years ago, I was like turning the People's Daily, I would check the earlier issues. I spent hours, days on those things.
Yeah,
just want to confirm one thing, right? Now it's
Now you can do it in a few seconds. So it's really revolutionized this sort of one aspect of reporting on China, which has always been very important. But I think one of the concerns I have about it is that, a lot of these tools are based off, official data, which is in many cases sort of questionable. Particularly it's like GDP figures. A famous example where some Chinese leaders themselves have questioned their accuracy in the past. But also, if you're analyzing Chinese social media, you've got to take into account the fact that the social media is itself censored. So, in many ways, these tools are analyzing sort of the illusion that's been created. So I think they are very useful, but you still need that sort of human intelligence to really sort of make sense of those trends that you're spotting. But Sarah, have you used any of these sort of AI tools in your reporting?
Less so the AI tools. I work quite closely with our colleagues, our data colleagues, but I think maybe being on the ground, I've been trying to make the most of talking to ordinary people, talking to experts in these different fields. So more of the kind of returning to shoe leather reporting as all of this becomes more high tech. But I agree with Yuan Li about what you were saying, how you shouldn't underestimate how much people still want to talk. So we discussed how there are so many more challenges now, and the environment has become much more restrictive across a variety of factors. But I do think there are still so many people who want you to get the China story right. Like in my short 2.5 years there, I've met so many people who are so generous in explaining to me how they understand a dynamic at play or an industry, what you can't really see on the surface, who are willing to introduce you to other people who understand the thing you're writing about, and people on the street. I think it becomes a numbers game in some ways. Like, yes, you'll face more rejections in China than in other places, but the more people you try to stop on the street and ask them what they think about inheritance tax or what they think about U.S.-China relations, I think you still are able to find a lot of people who are willing to share their views and they want to be heard. And so I think it's like a return to shoe leather reporting that has served me well in the past 2 years.
And I think it's about sort of using that in combination with these sort of new tools and some of the open source intelligence. It's about creating a sort of composite picture, isn't it? It's like a sort of pixelated image and
the zero in and zoom in and zoom out, and
right.
It's really it's kind of interesting.
And there's a risk in relying on any one of these areas or maybe two of them too much. But if you sort of use it all, you take what's in state media, you use open source intelligence to sort of see if you can verify that. You then sort of do your shoe leather reporting to sort of talk to people on the ground to see if that tallies, and then you end up with something close to the truth. You do your best. And it's certainly it's very time consuming, more time consuming than it used to be. But Li, we were talking before about sort of one of the new challenges or newer challenges is in sort of developing news sources. I know you've thought a lot about this, particularly when you're based overseas, and I feel the same way. It's you can keep in touch with old ones to a certain extent, but developing new ones is really challenging, isn't it?
Yeah, and also it's. I talked to somebody last week, another journalist covering China, and we're talking about how some sources just disappeared, right? Some sources like, don't talk to me, you're dangerous. And it's just because we are journalists. And there are people who actually want to talk to you. Yeah, we always want to develop new sources, and it's as you mentioned that we can travel since we are based out of China, and we can travel to different places. And I just went to Japan, and I went to this amazing stand-up comedy show by this very young guy, 30 years old, and he's exiled, like used to be the biggest star, one of the biggest stars in China, and he's now on exile. He just did this stand-up comedy show in Tokyo, and it was sold out. 1,000 people just showed up, and that was like, it's really like there are, as you mentioned, like the overseas Chinese, like there are like people come and go, like they go in and out of China, and those are like really valuable sources for us. But there are also people who left, and they're building. I wrote maybe 2 years ago, like they're rebuilding a China, building a new China, building a China they aspire, they want to outside China. So there are all kinds of things people are doing, and it's definitely, it's not the same as Sarah, like in China, but it's also like how you get a feel of China from like people you meet outside China. It's kind of interesting.
I think the concern I have, I mean, I'm basically a political reporter, and for me, the big problem in reporting on China today is the absence of those political sources who can give you some sort of insight into what's going on in the leadership. That was always hard to get those contacts, but as we were touching on earlier, because of the the business environment and the political environment sort of 10, 20 years ago, it was so much easier to meet particularly relatives and friends of people in leadership positions, because a lot of their family members were in business. Maybe they shouldn't have been, but they were. Even generals, kids, whatever. So it was still possible to do that kind of reporting, and I think there's this sort of hollowness at the at the core of our understanding about China. And if you take Xi Jinping's military purges, he's just sacked almost his entire military command, including his most senior general, Jiang Youxia, and we really don't know sort of what is behind that, other than the official narrative that, the General Jiang Youxia, he was accused of defying Xi Jinping's authority. What does that mean? Was it to do with sort of like a personal animosity? Was it a difference over, military strategy or tactics? We just don't know. It's incredibly important, it has implications for...
Yeah, it's just very difficult, like covering Chinese politics. Remember, we went to a same event right before Xi Jinping took over China, and I don't know if you remember, we were at the same dinner event, and I was sitting next to a pretty prominent business person, and he just left his phone intentionally on table, and it was the full 7 members of the Politburo, like
the standing committee, right?
Yes, yes, and it was accurate, actually more accurate, like 100% accurate. But of course, we were not able to verify it with other sources, so it did not meet the standard of the Wall Street Journal. But it was possible. Yeah. Those people had accesses. Those people, they had access to very top people within the Chinese government, and I just can't imagine that happening now.
No. And with those big sort of, when I think back, the big sort of political crises that I covered, particularly the Falun Gong protests, and then the Bo Xilai scandal, I think, reporters did manage to get a pretty good understanding of what had happened. And that's just so much harder to do today. And so you have this sort of illusion of stability which endures, and but it's quite possible that there's something, some really significant turmoil that's happening sort of behind the scenes in China today, which are going to actually sort of determine its future, but we just don't know what's happening. And on that portentous note, I would like to get to questions. I've seen some of you in the room have already sent some in as we've been talking, and we've also asked podcast listeners to submit a few in advance, so we'll try our best to answer as many as we can in the time left. To start with, from Julian, who is in the audience, he asks, how has the press corps changed over the years in terms of knowledge sharing and collaboration? Good question. Sarah, what's your sense of how collaborative are reporters these days?
Yeah, I think as the press corps shrinks, I think maybe the collaboration and the camaraderie increases. I think we're often talking about our experiences of which cities we have a harder time in. It's not like, well, depending on who you are, you might get tailed in every city, but for many of us, we're not going to get tailed in every city. And so we're sharing experiences about, okay, Hefei is very sensitive because all of the high tech is there and they'll monitor you very closely. So stuff like that, I think we're constantly discussing with friends across different outlets. I'm not sure back when you two were reporting what you would have been sharing more.
Were we collaborative? I mean, we were, but were we collaborative with?
We were colleagues, yeah.
It was a pretty competitive environment. I mean, in a good way.
As it should be, right?
Yeah, yes. In that sort of golden era. I think some of my colleagues from the New York Times, which was I was at the Wall Street Journal then. We competed very intensely with the Post and the Times.
Yes, we all tried to beat each other.
Yeah,
yes.
and I think that was was a very sort of good thing. It helped us to sort of produce better stories. So next question from Ruzbe Vakil, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, who sent in a question on covering political corruption. This was an email question. He asked, given the lack of independent investigative journalism in China, how can we determine the authenticity of reports on topics like purges? Very good question. Li, I'm going to throw that one to you.
No, I don't cover politics.
Okay.
It's yours.
Yeah, it's a really good question. We obviously you see the sort of the external signs of these purges. Sometimes they're confirmed in state media, not always. Sometimes it's the absence of information. People just don't show up at meetings where they should be, or their names disappear from websites where they were previously listed. And then you can sometimes then you get some insight into the reason for the purge. That often comes out later, when they're prosecuted or they go to trial. But that's always that's the official narrative. And then the challenge is always to try and sort of dig beneath that and find out what really happened. And short answer is it's really hard. It goes back to that question of human sources. If you don't know sort of family members or friends of the people who've been purged, or people who've discussed those purges with senior people who are in the know, then you just don't hear about it. And that's, I think, where we are with this Zhang Youxia case, where there's been a little bit of reporting into the official explanation that's been given. There's the one that's been published through Xinhua and the Defense Ministry. The Wall Street Journal had a piece suggesting that in an internal meeting, Zhang Youxia had been accused of sharing nuclear secrets with the Americans, which is obviously pretty explosive. But that's still, if that's correct, that was something that was said at an internal meeting about Zhang Youxia. Still doesn't tell us really what was the cause of that. Was it a personal dispute with Xi Jinping? Was it a difference over tactics and strategy? So anyway, very hard to. Sarah, do you have thoughts on the subject?
I guess on the question of the absence of investigative journalism, I guess one thing to point out is that there are still so many talented Chinese journalists in China, and some of them are still investigative journalists, and I think they're so talented, but I think the risks for them are even higher. So I think that's one area where if they were able to do more of their work without constraints. So since moving to Beijing, the biggest investigative report to come out was by Beijing News, and there was a reporter there who reported on truckers who were delivering cooking oil, and they had previously been transporting industrial oils that in their tanks, and they were so rushed that they never washed their trucks before putting cooking oil in. And so this was something that was happening. People knew about it, but this Chinese investigative journalist went undercover and wrote this detailed report that was explosive. Everyone on WeChat was talking about it. So this isn't elite politics, but I think it went to show that there are still really talented, devoted local journalists who could also help solve more of these questions, the puzzle, if they were given a bit more room.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A question from Ping, who's also in the audience. For people who have never lived in China or experienced real censorship, what's something about the information environment in China that is the most misunderstood? What do you often have to clarify? Li, what?
Wow. It's a great question, but I don't know if I have a very good answer. What's the...
But when you're explaining sort of China and the information environment to people who are sort of less familiar with it, what?
Right. Yeah, I've been seeing this a lot, but the Chinese internet is very heavily censored, but there is still a ton of information if you look closely. People still share things, but now it just gets like it's much harder to post many things because the algorithm, the censorship system, they just got so much better. But still, people manage to post things, and then a lot of them are deleted quickly. But a lot of them also got like a screenshot, like people like would repost if you follow account on Twitter X. It's called the 李老师不是你老师 Teacher Li's account, and people inside China, they still push, like they still send him like information, and so he posted on Twitter, like outside the Chinese censorship. So I think that's what I say. Like it's very heavily censored. It's so much harder than 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. But still, you can get a lot if you look really closely, if you know where to look. But of course, I spent way too much time on Chinese social media. It's not healthy, but yeah.
It's a very good point. The Chinese censorship system is designed to stop things from being sort of proliferated at scale, from reaching a point where it becomes a sort of social problem. So it doesn't always sort of stop stuff from being posted in the first place.
Yeah.
So you can, if you...
It's not 100%, right? It's still not 100%. It used to be like maybe 10%, 20%, and now it's maybe like 70, 60, 70%, but still. Yeah. And also a lot of times, like you have to read the comment section of Chinese social media, and it's just, sometimes it's just like I have so much fun reading the comments.
And people are really inventive with the way they invent these sort of oblique terms.
And Chinese people have a great sense of humor if you read the comments. And they're so clever in how to bypass the censors, create new terms. So it's like really, really fun. Yeah. Of course, it's depressing, but it's also fun.
We have a question from Lucas in the audience, and I think this will probably be the last one. With such scrutiny and suspicion around foreign journalists, especially with constant stories of being tailed, why do you think China allows foreign journalists to come in the first place? Why not just reject their visas?
That's a great question, right?
It is a good question. Sarah?
I think they still need... we had talked about earlier of how it's hard to get the whole picture in China, and you're trying to, through various channels, get the closest approximation. And I think even for the leaders, for the government, they also need to, one, know what's happening across this massive country, and having journalists go out and report on the social issues. And I think that's informative for them too. But I think the maybe more pragmatic reason for them might be they need the world to know about China too. And so some of that is they need the world to know about their commodities and their products that they're exporting. But I think there's a mix of both foreign journalists also being able to serve that function of illuminating topics that local journalists might not be allowed to report on or really push further on, while also serving the purpose of trying to explain trends in China to the world.
Li, do you have any thoughts on that?
China is the second biggest economy in the world, and China is the biggest trading partners of many more countries than the United States. And the Chinese government export is now probably the biggest engine of the Chinese economy. You do need the world to understand China a little bit. It's not a very good image for the world to consider China a black box, which we tend to use a lot of times. It's not a black box, but like the Chinese government doesn't want people to consider it a black box. They want to have shed some light of what's going on at least in the economy, and they also want foreign direct investment. This is like, think of the Chinese government as like the China Corp, right? They run a big corporation. You can't just like close, and you want to trade. You want people to invest, and there's a lot at stake for the leadership. And if the economy is really down, it's not good for the rule of Xi Jinping.
Yeah. I'd agree with both of you. I'd also think, China has always really cared about its international image. I think they've tried for a long time to sort of hone that image through their own Chinese state media outlets, and they've slowly sort of understood that those don't really sort of work that well with foreign audiences, in spite of investing a lot of money in it, whatever. So I think that's one reason they like to have certain sort of limited numbers of foreign journalists. And I think increasingly they feel that they have a good story to tell, feeling increasingly confident with their own achievements, their own position in the world, about their sort of relative advantages compared to the United States, especially. And so, I think that it's partly they want to, try to convince foreign audiences that their message has validity, and they want people to see things on the ground in China which sort of support the state narrative. And the problem comes that, there's an awful lot of stuff which doesn't necessarily fit with the narrative, and all governments, all countries, there are mistakes are made, and within the top leadership, there are, human beings who are as vulnerable as anyone else to, vanity, insecurity, ambition, jealousy. It doesn't matter how brilliant they are. These are just natural sort of human instincts which can affect decision making. And I think the problem comes often that sort of foreign journalists like to sort of dig into that aspect of things as well. I think that's all we have time for. So I'd just like to thank you, Li, especially for joining us on Drum Tower. It's been so good to have you on the
Thank you for
podcast
having
and
me.
to see you after so many years.
Yes.
Look forward to hearing lots more from Booming Bai. And thank you to the Asia Society for hosting us tonight, and thank you all for joining us.